Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CCA, the third day of our first ever digital conference. I'm Liz Barclay. I'm a CCA director. I'm also chair of the Standards Council, and I'm delighted to be here again to host the third and final day of, as I say, our first ever digital online conference. The conference was to be hosted at the Etihad Stadium in Manchester, and of course, events overtook us. However, we've had a great first 2 mornings. Today will be just as good. We were joined yesterday by a great cast of speakers, and all at CCA would like to thank Amy Chappell, who's the Executive Officer at Capita, Dan Britton from NHS Business Services Authority, Richard Chataway from the BVA Nudge Unit, and William Montgomery from Ask 10. Now, each of those presentations was full of insight. And just to give you a flavour, a hybrid model of home working and office working is likely to remain for the next year. We all know that, but probably well into the future. And this presents both customers and employees at all levels with opportunity. The adoption of the infrastructure, the management, and the systems for home working at such speed gives new opportunity to bring greater diversity to the workplace now and into the future. For customers as well as your team, how you say it is as important as what you say, especially when communication is happening virtually. And leadership in a hybrid workforce is not about taking charge, but about taking care of those in your charge. And that was just a few of the thoughts from the speakers yesterday. I'd like to say thank you once again to our sponsors. Our gold sponsors are Oracle, Twilio and Vonage, and our silver sponsors, Poly. Without those sponsors, we simply wouldn't be able to run this conference. So a big, big thank you to you. We've got a great lineup for this morning again. We're going to split into 2 sessions with a little break around 11:30 for a comfort break or a coffee. We are going to kick off with a presentation from Roz Taylor, about whom more in a minute. After Roz, then we have Ross Vincent, who is Head of Workplace Pensions at Scottish Widows. We have the second debate of the event, and that's entitled The Future of Work. We then have our comfort break, after which we'll hear from Andy Menz, Director of Operations at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And then finally, we'll hear from Professor Liberty Vittert, who will share her views on the future. But first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Roz Taylor, who is a business psychologist who is here to talk to us today about the pandemic positives.
Hello, my name is Roz Taylor, and I am CEO of RTC Leadership and Coaching, part of the In Touch Group. And today I'm talking to you about the pandemic. I'm talking about isolating ourselves. I'm talking about lockdown and how we can view it in a slightly more appreciative way. That's today's challenge. And as a psychologist, I'm just going to share my screen with you. I should know about such things, but I kind of went through it too. So my challenge to myself and to you is to look for the positives in this pandemic. First of all, I had to think through my own thinking and realize that I was thinking very negatively. And this is a list of kind of negative or dysfunctional thinking, as psychologists call it. I was labeling this whole thing as a complete disaster. When this all started in March, 3 weeks, we've got to be indoors for 3 weeks. Of course, it's 3 months now, but that's beside the point. And this was a complete disaster to me. I had absolutely all or nothing thinking. I had to cancel 2 holidays, one imminently and another one in the near future. And I thought, that's it, we'll never go on holiday again, which is gloriously all or nothing thinking. No shades in between. We could actually do something in Britain. Heavens, never thought of that. This is just a disaster. Or we overgeneralize, one food parcel, one food delivery didn't turn up, and that's it, we'll just starve. We'll starve. If this doesn't happen, we'll starve. And I was prone to exaggerating and catastrophizing. I was thinking, we go on a holiday to a wee place in Lanzarote, that's it, we'll never go again. I mean, we'll have to sell it. And we have that kind of unraveling, catastrophizing, at least I did. We completely ignored the positives. I stomped about saying, there is absolutely nothing positive about being in the house for 3 weeks. And then I negatively predicted the future. I could see tumbleweed going through every city in the UK, if not abroad, whereas there wouldn't be a shop or a restaurant left to open to us. And that was my negative thinking. I'm not sure if that relates to any of your thinking. And before you move on to positive thinking, you've really got to kind of reality check some of this. And that's what I had to start to do. What was realistic in any of my thinking? And could somehow or another I get something more positive out of what we were doing? And so this is what you need to do. You need to look at the evidence for your thinking. And I realized as we looked around the world and people had gone into lockdown sooner than us, then they were coming back to life. And yes, there was a cafe, not in Scotland at the moment, of course. We just look on enviously at other people. But there was evidence of life after lockdown. There were alternative ways, perhaps, of doing stuff. Maybe virtual drinks were all right if the drinks weren't virtual. They were actually in your hand. And there was some learning to be gained out of this. So that was my journey to feeling, and also take some action and change my behaviors, and probably shut up would be a really good start. So in a way, I had to come to this lovely conclusion, which is you problem solve or you emotionally cope. There really are only two ways. Raj Purso wrote a very big, thick book, but actually it all came down to this. You problem solve or you emotionally cope. And I had written in all sorts of things where the BBC say, put your comments here and we will get back to you. Well, they never did, so clearly ignored my comments. I had been fulminating to anybody who would listen to the decision-making of those in power. I'd written letters, I had talked to friends. I was exhausted with it, really. And I thought, you know what? I'm not influencing this in any kind of way. I'm going to have to suck it up and emotionally cope. And that was the beginning of me kind of moving on. So here were a few questions. And clearly there are people who have been through hell and back with ill and awful, relatives in hospital, and parents who have died during all of this, and how to squeeze some positive out of any of that. I really don't know. It must have been horribly hard. But for those who perhaps weren't on that kind of brink, could we actually challenge ourselves a little? And so my challenge to me was, what could you do? I'm speaking to myself in lockdown that you've never done before and could perhaps continue to do thereafter. How could I cheer myself and others up? And what lessons could you have learned in all of this? And I also asked some people around me as well, some of my team at RTC and some of the team at CCA. And for me, well, what came out for me? Let me just stop sharing for a minute so I can eyeball you, because I really want you to beginning to think of this as well. But for me, and I'm looking at my mind map here of the positives I wrote down, I decided I was going to run every day, which meant that although I might have a shirt up here, down here, you don't want to know, are tracksuit bottoms and my running shoes. So at any moment in between Zooming, I could run around the block or whatever. And I kind of challenged myself to run longer and longer each day. I had the virus, which was interesting, early on in March with friends who returned from Rome. And instead of self-isolating, decided to come and stay with us for the weekend. Very kind. And so all four of us have the virus. I don't know if we've got the antibodies, but there's no doubt. I realise I've lived to tell the tale, so that's given me a little bit more confidence. I mean, of course, I will put a face mask on and do all of that, but it's made me feel a little bit more positive about going out and about. So my positives, where I've been running every day and I really want to keep that going, there's that wonderful thing that if you want to form a habit, you've got to do it every day for 3 weeks and then another 9 weeks to turn that habit into a new behavior. So I've been doing it now for quite a while, what, 2 months? So it makes me antsy if I don't get out. And I think the only time I haven't been running is when it was really raining. I'm a fair weather runner, I'll admit to that. And so I've lost weight, which is good. I mean, after not eating for about 7 days as a result of the virus, the challenge was to try and keep that off. Um, and also, I've been in one place for the first time in about 20 years. I'm normally traveling every couple of weeks. Shanghai, well, we won't be going there again in a hurry, but Shanghai, and then Gaithersburg or Gothenburg. Cambridge, I was always on the move, and I've actually been in the one place and it's not been that bad. And of course it's 3 months now, so it's really not been that bad. And I've actually cleared out cupboards and organized things. I'd never have thought I would say that with a smile on my face. Well, almost a smile. And so there have been things have been good. And when I asked others what they felt about all of that, some people were domestic gods and goddesses. I mean, quite fabulous things. They were cooking cakes and puddings. They were dancing in the kitchen. Well, golly, maybe we didn't always do that. And Joe Wicks, who knew of Joe Wicks? Who was he before all of this? Who knew? But now, of course, you know, everybody is working out to it. Well, almost everybody. Zoom, my goodness, Zoom. We used to use it very occasionally. And now here am I sharing screens with you. Who knew before? And not actually making a mess of it, which I used to do all the time. People volunteered for stuff. They were volunteering to make soup for people and take it round, volunteering to go to aged neighbours. I mean, really, really quite wonderful things. People were discovering outdoors, gardening, really for the first time. Folk were saying, gosh, birds land in my garden. A friend of mine said, who knew they did? And she was actually going outside to look at them and listen to them. My husband, we've got a tree stump in our garden because a tree was felled, a huge tree. And so he's decided to hack it all away and create a little kind of bar area. And he's called the stump Donald Stump, because he feels it invigorates his digging, that he can dig and wield an axe with quite a lot of energy on Donald Stump. He's also stained it slightly orange, which I think is a bridge too far myself, but hey, he likes it. And so he's really kept in shape with Donald Stump. Who knew? Also, I think we've been talking to neighbours more. You know, when we were clapping for the NHS, maybe that's a little bit selfish of us, but we kind of waved at a person and had a chat, maybe a little bit of self-approbation. We could have been less of that and frankly just pay the NHS more. But check out people. I had a long conversations with checkout people. Where were they meant to be going on holiday, and you know, were they enjoying working? Did they feel safe? A whole load of stuff I would never have thought to ask a checkout person, because, well, it's the only person you'd seen all day. And so really forging these really fabulous and unusual links. And in terms of work, some of my work colleagues have come back to me to say, we've had more meetings now while we've been in isolation than we did when we were at work. We're talking to people more. Every morning and evening, we're checking in. We know, you know, we've got virtual drinks on a Friday where we all meet up as a team. And then we've got lunch and learns with our consultants. 50 consultants come on a call every Wednesday at lunchtime. And we're doing a lunch and learn so that we're updating ourselves and skills. it never occurred to me to do that on a weekly basis before. And so we've become closer as a group as well. So amazing things have actually come out of this. And so, any lessons that we've learned? Well, there was an amazing piece. Let me just get this for. This is one of the CCA ones. Um, from a husband. My wife now knows what retirement may look like. She's now canvassing actively for the retirement age to be raised to 80. And he suspects maybe never, because clearly she doesn't want to be left at home with him. Some people were feeling that they're that when something was taken away from you, you suddenly realized you had loads of activities that you wanted to do. And so this person was really planning for the future, for staycation trips and things that they had never thought about before. Other people, lesson learned patience. People said, we don't really have to rush around. We could be so patient. And we really need to be patient in queues now. In fact, somebody came up, I was queuing for Homebase to buy some plants. And this guy, it was a very long queue, came up and said, why was I queuing? And I said, to get inside. He said, no, but why? And I said, well, I want to buy plants. Well, which plants? I'm thinking, this is a bit intrusive. Geraniums, is that all right? He said, there are none. So, well, that was okay. And then I didn't have to queue. Who knew? It was a little too draconian, I felt, his tone of voice, but hey, let's not be picky. Freedom to travel is precious, and we must really, really realize that for the future. Having a work-life balance. I'm not sure my work-life balance has got any better being at home. I seem to be pinned to Zoom quite constantly. I was about to say going to the toilet was even difficult, but that's too much. That's an overshare, I think. And I think there's something around understanding that we've got a global community, that I've been plugged into friends around the globe just to make sure that they're okay, and that our community is truly global, that we need to stay safe so that everybody else around the world can be safe as well. That's an interesting responsibility. And one person said, I'm absolutely getting an office. I am not sitting working on Zoom in my living room anymore. And just a last thought, my husband actually said, because I got him to do it too, it said it was really important, if you're ever going to be locked down, that you're married to the right person. And I thought, oh, that's lovely. Until I thought, oh, I wonder if that was me. Maybe it's not. I'll have to go and ask him. That one has just come in hot off the presses. So I think my challenge to you, moving on from my last slide for all of this, is for you to look at your pandemic positive checklist. What could you do from lockdown that you started that you could continue to do? Remember, 3 weeks and another 9 to turn it into a new behavior. And how can you keep cheering yourself up, yourself and others up as you go forward with this? Because there will be setbacks. And always remember and write down the lessons that you've learned. And, there's something that when we review these positives, that we should write them down. Writing down positives means that we'll remember them. Or in the middle of the night when we're having a tough time, is just turning to these positives and reading them, either having them on your phone, although you're not meant to do that, just read them, write them in pencil, and read them, and that keeps us on track. So I hope some of these positives during the pandemic will linger with us, and that we won't just go back to normal, because I think we really, really are going to have a new normal. So thank you very much, and have a good conference.
Thank you to the psychologist Roz Taylor. What a great way to kick off a conference. Certainly, I haven't cleaned out any cupboards. I didn't catastrophize quite, but I must admit, I loved Donald's stump, and I certainly won't forget that, Roz. My positive is having time to spend with my pup, who's been growing up during lockdown, and I've problem solved today. There is something going on down there, as Ros put it. I have my feet on the dog's cooling mat. Dog isn't pleased, but please don't call the RSPCA. Okay, Ros, thank you very, very much indeed for that. Really appreciated. And let's move on to Ross Vincent. Ross is head of workplace pensions at Scottish Widows. We asked him a few questions earlier this week about his response to COVID-19 and what the future might hold for his team.
I'm Ross Vincent and I'm the head of workplace pensions at Scottish Widows. Scottish Widows, as you may well know, is a part of Lloyds Banking Group, who is our parent company. So within workplace pensions, we have around 300 colleagues in our contact centre, and their primary role is to support tens of thousands of businesses in supplying workplace pensions to their employees. We're based in Edinburgh, not too far from Princes Street, just overlooking Edinburgh Castle, albeit we now find ourselves fully working remote. Yeah, so we had a small amount of homework, and about 10% of our operation was enabled for homeworking prior to COVID-19. And that was actually on the back of obtaining our accreditation to the CCA's global standard. And as part of the gap analysis, when we were first obtaining our accreditation, we noticed homeworking wasn't something that we had tried before. So throughout 2019, we ran a series of pilots to get a number of our colleagues enabled for home working. So not to the scale we find ourselves now, but prior to COVID-19, we had about 10% of our operation that worked from home. Yeah, I think the key difference, I guess, on the back of COVID-19 would be colleague suitability. And what I mean by that is the sort of 30 or so colleagues who were enabled for home working in 2019. Those colleagues had volunteered to be part of the pilot, and their line manager had sponsored them in terms of having the right level of experience and demonstrating the right sort of values and behaviours. So I guess where we find ourselves now post COVID-19 is that all colleagues are now working from home. And I think it became quite apparent very quickly that home working just isn't for everyone. And there's a number of reasons for that. You know, one of the things we found is colleagues' physical home environment, so not having the right amount of space to have a comfortable workstation at home. And first, you know, we read a lot in the media at the moment about the increase in domestic abuse. And you know, that's another consideration that we've been working with colleagues. So yeah, colleague suitability, I think, has been the main difference post COVID-19. We have all colleagues, so all 300 colleagues, which is myself right down to the frontline staff. Yeah, there are a number. I think one I would pull out is what I describe as the remote coaching model. So I think if we put ourselves in the shoes of a frontline colleague who was based in the office, if they needed support with handling any customer transaction, they could place the customer on hold if it was on a call, for example, and they would be able just to turn to their left and right and speak to colleagues next to them to obtain support. Whereas now at home, whilst they're still speaking to customers through our telephony channel, that support isn't as readily available. And what we need to do is find ways through all the technology we have in front of us now, such as WebEx and Skype and Link, etc., to try and make that remote support as accessible as possible for colleagues to ensure that they feel supported, but also that it doesn't start impacting on customer service. The frontline manager who are leading teams between the sizes of sort of 15 and 20 colleagues. So I know our frontline managers are finding it really tough at the moment just to stay connected with their teams. So whilst we're making the most of the technology we've got out there, these frontline managers before would be sitting in the office in amongst their team and have their 15 to 20 direct reports sitting around them. So in between meetings or various tasks, they could easily just swivel around in their chair, have a conversation, check in with their team, do a bit of a floor walk. Whereas now being remote, it's quite difficult to connect with your team as a as quickly as they would have been able to do before, and it's quite forced and actually takes quite a lot of effort to making sure you're scheduling the right amount of whether it be team shouts, team huddles, one-to-one conversations. Whereas you could have done a lot of that ad hoc, just being in the office and walking around. The frontline managers having to put a lot of effort and planning into ensuring that they're staying connected with all their colleagues on a daily basis. So I know one of the things we're looking at is, what does the future of the team manager's span of control look like now that we are working remotely? And I think my view on that is that we need to decrease our spans of control if we're going to remain remote, to create the capacity for the team manager to make sure that they can keep connected with their colleagues. Yeah, so that's something we are turning our attention to now. We haven't made those decisions yet, but I think going back to my point on colleagues' suitability, I don't think we'll find ourselves having 100% of colleagues working from home on a permanent basis. I would predict that around 3/4 of our colleagues will remain at home and work remotely, and that the other quarter will return and transition back to the office where they will feel best placed and more supported. But I guess one of the benefits it gives us is that we have all the infrastructure in place now to have that flexibility, so we can really tailor the role and location to the colleagues' individual needs, as opposed to before. We were our default position was that all colleagues needed to be in the office. I mean, one of the things we actually spoke about today was around sort of channel of choice for customers, and how we're probably seeing. I think perception was before was it was based on demographic. So being a pensions business, most of most customers who are engaged in their pension, tend to be towards retirement age, and you would make an assumption that people of that age would want to interact with you on the phone and in no other way. But I think we're kind of taking a different view on that now, and it's less about the demographic or the age of the customer, and it's more about what's the moment in time. So, for example, for us, if the customer is looking for basic policy information, maybe nominate their beneficiary on their pension in the event of them passing away, that's something that they're happy to do digitally. However, if they are looking to change their investment approach, or perhaps looking to discuss their retirement options, that's something they want to do by a phone conversation. Yeah, I think feelings are mixed. I think, first and foremost, I think colleagues are still very apprehensive with everything that's going on in the world related to COVID-19 just now. And I think, it's our job to make sure that we are providing colleagues with the right level of comfort, that it's, first and foremost safe to return on site. And I think once we've done that, again, I think the feelings will be quite mixed. I know a lot of colleagues don't miss the travel into the office. So for those who would prefer to come into the office, I think they've got the aspects of travelling to and from again to consider. But for the small number who we will transition back, I think they'll be really pleased, and I think they're looking forward to get back on site when safe to do so. From a logistical point of view, whilst we are in a large office in Edinburgh, you do find the sort of walkways being quite narrow. So there is a lot of signage within the office now. There's a one-way system around the floors, passing points. It's quite visible now when you come into the office. There is also sort of enhanced cleaning. We have sort of sanitizers at regular points across the walkways. And we are predicting that we will need to maintain the 2-metre social distancing guidance that's been set from the government. So from a physical desk point of view, our sort of banks of desks are between sort of 6 and 8, but you're typically only going to find about 2 or 3 colleagues to a bank of desks now, in light of us having to respect that social distance that's in place. Yeah, there are a number. I think the key one I would draw out would just be the collaboration from colleagues. So the way in which all colleagues across all the different business areas, not just the frontline operating team, our partners and finance and risk and transformation, how we've all collaborated as one team, and really supported one another to get through these challenging times. So I think all of our colleagues have gone above and beyond in what was a really uncertain time for everybody. We had a large number of colleagues right up until the middle of middle of April, sorry, who continued to come on site and really put themselves at risk in order to keep the show on the road for our customers. So yeah, I think sort of teamwork and collaboration will be the one that sticks with me the most. Yeah, I think I would probably reflect a bit on sort of transparent communication. So um, I think, where possible within the operation, we do and try and be as transparent as possible with colleagues. However, there are times that you maybe only, give part of the message, or you maybe don't tell colleagues as quickly as they would maybe like. And I think, a situation like this where it is, colleagues' health, we just had to be 100% transparent from the off. And if we didn't, we would have quickly lost the kind of trust and respect from our colleagues who were looking at us as the leadership team for that sort of reassurance. So I think the biggest learning for me is actually how important, but also how helpful being really transparent and upfront when communicating to colleagues in the front line can actually help and get colleagues on side very, very quickly.
Ross, I'm going to do the technological equivalent of that swivel round in my chair and introduce the panel for the debate. Ross is joining that panel. So we have Ross Vincent, Head of Workplace Pensions at Scottish Widows. We have Joanne Wilson, Function Head for RBS, and Richard Kenny, who is the Senior Product Manager, Marketing Manager for Poly. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. I would love questions from the audience, please. So if you could use the Q&A or the chat buttons at the bottom of your screen, that would be great, and post your questions. I will try to get those to the panel. But we're talking about the future of work. Our world of work, as we just heard there from Ross, is changing. The pandemic has accelerated the implementation of home working strategies, amongst other things. And as we enter the next phase, the focus is on returning to efficiency, service improvements, and providing greater customer experience. So as we begin to investigate the options for the new operating models, what will the future look like? Now, if I could just start, panel, with that very last point that Ross made, transparent communications and how important they are in the scheme of things now when we are operating virtually. What is the future of communications within the workforce? How can we really ensure that if we have some of our workforce working digitally, virtually, remotely, call it what you like, and some of our people in the office, how can we absolutely nail this one? Because it is extremely important. Joanne, do you want to kick us off on this?
Absolutely, Liz, and thank you very much for having me. It's just a real pleasure to be part of the summer convention, and particularly the session on future of work. So thank you, everyone, and well done to everyone for the digital convention. You should be so proud. Look, I know Ross has covered this in his piece around the whole future of around the communication piece, and that is so key. And he's absolutely right. That's what our team managers are probably struggling with the most. We've probably underestimated, how much of our centres are such a social hub, and in many cases they're very much the family. There are people come into work for family purposes, to be surrounded with people they love and doing things for customers that they love. So we are still playing about, Liz, with what is the right type of communication in these. We're playing with Skype, with instant messenger, with Zoom, and the key bit is really just staying connected and really trying to understand each person as an individual as to what is going on in their individual circumstances. So it's absolutely key. And I would say it continues to be very much a work in progress for us, because we have had such a buzz from being in our centres and staying connected with each other. It's the reason we do what we do, because we love that connectivity piece.
Interesting to hear you say that, Joanne. And if anybody has cracked this one, please will they let us know through the chat or the Q&A button. Richard, I'm assuming that as you are a marketing manager and communication is absolutely at the forefront of everything you do, this is something that you know is being thought about at Poly too.
Yeah, quite significantly. I always used to take the approach that I wasn't getting the communication right until somebody was actually complaining about too much communication. Then I figured I'd usually have it at about the right level. So the second one is that, you know, we've had this sort of open, honest view. Suddenly we've seen our leaders in their houses. We've seen our leaders in their sort of casual clothing. And that really should be triggering this sort of honest approach to communications as well. And as a leader, if you're asking people to do these certain acts, you've got to be able to follow them through yourself. So that sort of open, honest communication and living that approach that you're asking your employees to do. Those are the two things that we've found really successful over here for any sort of cultural change. And I'd really echo what Joanne said about don't cookie cutter this. Don't look for industry best practice. Don't try and do what other people are doing. Survey out to your people really regularly, really often, find out what their needs are, and then try and go for this individualized approach for people.
Do you think, though, that there's a danger that we're underestimating the complexity of frontline roles? So, you know, when we're busily trying to communicate, etc., we're not always getting the nuance that should be coming through to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think yesterday one of the sort of speakers mentioned the idea that we put a huge amount of effort into understanding customer journeys and what customers are expecting, but we don't do the same yet for what our employees are doing. You know, how many different screens they're having to scroll through to provide certain things. So I think we do significantly underestimate it. And in the past 3 months, it's got worse. Every call coming in now is an escalation. It's complex because people are under duress. They're in more complex situations in their personal life, their work life, their education life, everything. So I think that, you know, getting a focus on our people and ensuring they're trained and equipped, that's the best way to deal with this. And sort of, you know, recognizing that there are going to be situations where it's too complex for people. And again, that approach back to being honest with people, honest with customers. If we can't do it right now, let's say that we can't do it and say when we will do it, and then stick to those guidelines.
Joanne, I see you've unmuted yourself. Is the equivalent,
Yeah.
is the technological equivalent of going, me please?
No, look, I'm exactly the same, Liz, as well, following on from Richard. We really, you know, very complex role that the guys do across the industry. It's one of the toughest jobs, I always say. And I think just listening to some of the good stuff that Ross has talked about, the positive side of the pandemic is around, you know, it's really encouraging customers to do more simple things automated, and the complexity is more coming into the role with that human touch. And then I think it's having that ability to translate complexity into simplicity as well with the customer, that we're not making it sound more complicated than it is. We sort of try to stick to, there are 3 key things, you know, clarity, capability and motivation is around, you know, has the agent real clarity on what they're expected to do? Have we trained them sufficiently? And it's even looking like, what's that agent, universal agent of the future, who's expected to be able to do everything? And then are they getting the motivation from their leader, and are they self-motivated themselves to do the role? We know how much the handoffs irritate our customers, handing off, and the impact that has on the NPS. So it's really having that first point of contact and that one agent that can deal with anything, regardless of the complexity. But I totally agree, we've really underestimated that.
You didn't mention the word empowerment. Is that because you don't think that we should go that far? We'll come back to that in a minute. Ross, you've unmuted yourself too, and I wonder if that means that you'd like to come in on that point about complexity.
Yeah, morning everyone. I'm living and breathing remote technical issues this morning, so apologies that you can't see me, but I am dialed in. I think the only, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think the only point I would pull out, and I covered this as part of the sort of Q&A earlier, is around colleague suitability. And I think we just need to tread carefully before we rush into decisions on what our future operating model will look like. Because if we decide that our contact centres are going to remain fully remote, we will lose a lot of our colleagues, because there are a large proportion of colleagues who just aren't comfortable with working from home. And as I talked about earlier, there's a variety of reasons for that. So in terms of the complexity of the frontline role, I do think we've probably underestimated it this far, and I think we just need to tread carefully in terms of the next steps, particularly around virtual operating model, and recognise that remote working is not going to be for everyone, and if we force them down that route, then we might see a number of our colleagues decide to leave and move elsewhere.
Yeah, I suppose that is a danger. Can I just put this question then that I think ties in and comes into this quite nicely, with some people wanting to come back to the office and others wanting to stay home working? That itself raises challenges for support and management from that perspective. Joanne, Richard, anybody want to come in on that?
And I think that's what, it's a great question, Liz, and that's what we're working through, is that hybrid model. But I think whilst it's a challenge, it gives us great opportunity too, from a diversity perspective as well, around even our attraction, because, maybe working moms, dads, carers, dependents, all of that, it gives us that opportunity for some people now that haven't been travelling, love the fact they've got a couple of hours back in their lives, and also they've had a positive impact financially. So it gives us that flexibility, and it's really working through what that hybrid model really looks like in the days and weeks ahead.
I think as well, I'm going to go back to the transparency point here. You don't want a them and us, with some people thinking that home working is a reward for best performer. I think Ross said it. You've got to look at what's the right people to work at home. You've got to have very clear, very well publicised home working policies. So you've got to have good broadband. You can't be doing childcare at home. You can't be a carer. So I think you've got to be open and transparent about that, and then find the right people to put into those roles, and also recognise it's not an either or. There's going to be people that want to come back to the office, but only want to come back for a certain amount of time, say 3 days a week. So again, don't cookie cutter this. Let's try and look for a more individualistic approach about what people's needs, and be transparent about it.
What I'm also hearing from some of the colleagues I work with is that they're worried about being the person who's working from home, in that they may be overlooked, that their colleagues who are in the office have got the ear of the CEO, etc. And so they may have great ideas, but they won't get credit for it. There's that aspect to it too, that we have to be quite clever to avoid that left out feeling.
Yeah, quite a significant number of people who want to return to the office are citing job security as one of those reasons. So I think that's absolutely got to be the case. And again, some of those transparent communications, those maybe one-on-one chats with people. So if you think you accidentally bump into the CEO at the water cooler, how do you arrange that digitally? Just sort of, even if it's 5-minute chats for people to hear it.
Yeah. We've got a point here from Dan Britton, who is the NHS Business Services CEO. We heard from Dan yesterday. He says it's really important for frontline agent colleagues who are now home working, but were recruited as office workers, to have the quiet spaces at home to manage customer inquiries, especially sensitive customer inquiries, for 8 hours a day. And I think that was partly the point that you were making, Ross. And for some, this just isn't possible when you're sharing home space, broadband connections, telephone connections, etc. How have you coped in your own organisations to set expectations around about this?
I'll kick off, Liz, if that's okay. We really has been on a very voluntary basis. For some, it isn't one size fits all. So, and we also have like a home bundle pack, which making sure our colleagues are set up for success at home, with their desk, with their headphone, that they've got health and safety right. They're not sitting on the edge of a sofa or whatever. So that whole setup is absolutely so important for us. But it has worked on those that would prefer to work from home and feel safer there. That's absolutely perfect. And for those that love to be in the office and the buzz, that's also perfect, because we've got the social distancing guidelines there. So it's really back to Richard's points and Ross's around, it's what works best for that individual. and then working with them on their flexibility where they will feel better.
Sorry, a little bit of feedback. Karen, no, sorry. Richard, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just saying what we've done as well is we've done sort of 2 lots of surveying work. We've looked at what of our facilities can reopen. So how many of them can sustain social distancing through corridors, elevators, entry points, etc. And then also survey our employees about who wants to and who can return. And you sort of grade the employees about urgent need to return, could return, or could stay at home. And you sort of then match those 2 up about getting those people who absolutely need to return, getting those into the office as a prioritizing point, etc. So if you're classified as a worker that can work from home, you don't get the priority on coming back into the office. It's reserved for those people who can't work at home.
Ross, a question here. Do you see a change in organizational structure and spans of control, particularly going into hybrid office home model?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we definitely need to review. I think on the spans of control front, I think it's now very challenging for frontline managers to try and lead, a large team of, say, 15 plus colleagues when working remote. And, again, I covered a bit of that earlier in terms of you no longer have the sort of natural interaction with your team during the day when you are sitting amongst them. So, it requires a lot of capacity and space to allow frontline managers to plan and organise, to make sure that, they're keeping connected with their colleagues. So as we move back to a hybrid model, perhaps that will get slightly easier because a proportion of their team will be in the office. But that's not to say that that line manager may be in the office alongside them. They may be choosing to work remotely or doing a bit of a mixture as well. So, something we've been looking at within Scottish Widows is, how do we create the capacity for the frontline managers to do what's most important, which is to communicate effectively with their colleagues, to listen to them, to check in with their well-being, and to be available. So, my gut feel on this is even if we move to a hybrid model of, say, 50% being remote and 50% being on site, there will still be a need to make sure that line managers feel like they've got the headspace to do a great job in terms of the way they lead their team.
Joanne, it's almost back to some of the things you said in answer to the first question about, how do we get the communications right? It's the training, etc.
Yeah. And totally agree that whole training, development piece is so important. And I totally agree with Ross's points on the span of control as well, as we're currently working on a 1 to 14 and had previously reduced that back from a 1 to 20. So it's just working through that hybrid model at the minute. And those that work from home full time, do they come in once a month for the team session or for their face-to-face session? Because when you are seeing them on Zoom, maybe not everyone wants to put their camera on, and really it's just lovely to have that really good well-being check-in with them as well from that perspective. But we're working on a basis now about 65 to 70% at home, and we have set up frontline workers during the pandemic, so it's relatively new to us as well, not for other workers in Royal Bank, but for the frontline workers it's been relatively new. So we're working through all of those sort of scenarios at the moment, but there definitely will be a check-in time for those that are working full-time from home, and that piece around well-being is so important and so key.
And pick up on that, Richard. The well-being thing is something that Dan has just come back on another part of his question. What about the challenges around safeguarding? Because there will be some colleagues that we only see on Zoom who might have been more vulnerable, but now can't either work from home or struggle to work from home because of their personal circumstances. This is a very difficult one.
Yeah, I think it's huge. A couple of things that we've looked at is, and you might sort of unexpected coming from a headset company, but can you put these people onto different types of work? So the things that people most struggle with at home are voice telephony, because that's in real time. You've got to answer those calls straight away. So can you put those people onto different work, which is asynchronous? Can you get them onto emails or maybe onto chats where there's less need to be instantly available? So you're able to support them a little bit in sort of working from home. Other things that we've done is sort of, get food deliveries out to those people. It's a little bit of hope and motivation for them. We've had some of our supervisors do a drive out and deliver pizza to some of those people. So obviously dependent on where everybody lives and what the contacts are available, but just to change the work they do, and really sort of see if you can get to them in some way or another to sort of really look after them. We think that potentially there's up to about 40% of people are going to come back in with some form of mental health issue. So we've really got to have an organization that's well prepared for positive and active interventions on people as well. We can't just sort of leave them at home and hope.
And this is something that we've been very interested in at CCA before COVID ever was ever on the horizon, and we will do more sessions, I think, as the year goes on that mental health, etc. But do you think, and I'm seeing this, do you think we'll see a resurgence or a desire for voice communication rising in future?
I'll take that one first. I think you're going to see like I said, a scales effectively. I think you're also going to see organizations that struggle to deal with volatile, unpredictable, complex demand and want to push that to digital because it helps with the approach. But you're going to see customers who are in difficult situations. And we're seeing that, it's not going to go away quickly. Customers want empathy from an organization. And you can't deliver that unless it's a human. So you're going to see organizations under financial pressures and demand pressures to deliver more digital, but our customers are going to want more voice contact with us because that's where you get the empathy from.
Joanne, I think we were thinking before this pandemic that perhaps we tipped the scales too far in the direction of digital, that we might have to go a bit more human. Do you think, following on from what Richard has said, we might see more of that human contact?
Absolutely, Liz, and particularly in some of the categories like our vulnerable customers, for example, and our over 70s, and we in financial services, as the number of financial services companies have, is set up a line for our vulnerable customers. And we saw the article this week around the biggest users of Zoom now and technologies are over 65s, and just really that hand holding through and that empathy and bringing that complexity to simplicity. I absolutely agree. It's more focused on that sort of vulnerable category and elderly customers as well and their needs. And we also saw a real requirement as well, working with the NHS workers too during the pandemic and giving them a dedicated line as well. So very much agree with what's been said, and obviously those type of calls are longer and different skill set again.
I have to say I've come across some really bad treatment of customers over this pandemic from organizations, not CCA members, who would say that they had set up good vulnerability processes. And actually, when push came to shove, they failed because there was all sorts of little things that they hadn't taken into consideration. So presumably there's still a lot of work to be done on this. Joanne? Sorry.
Yeah, it's still, we've had some fabulous customer testimonials from that line as well, where an agent has been able to get a customer set up and to get them cash and offering companion cards. So we're really proud of the proactivity in the vulnerable space, but always it's sometimes the journey or the process can sometimes be quite complex, and it's back to the point, complexity to simplicity for the customer.
And that's great that you share some of those ideas. Can I just have a last question to all three of you? What does the advisor of the future look like? Richard?
They look like a highly empowered individual who has a high level of knowledge and a high degree of organizational connectivity. They've got to solve really complex problems, so they've got to be highly skilled and highly connected, because they won't solve it on their own. They need to pull upon the skills of the rest of the organization, and they're supported by digital that takes away all the simple tasks from them so they can focus on giving that empathetic resolution to customers.
Joanne?
Very similar, Liz, multi-skilled, the universal agent. We've talked about empathy, empathetic as well, really emotionally connected with the customer, real strong emotional intelligence, and of course resilience is a key thing.
That's a word that cropped up several times yesterday. I think resilience is something that we need to have a look at and be a bit more dig down to see what we really mean by that. Ross, what does the advisor of the future look like?
Yeah, so echo everything that's been said so far. I think the only thing I would add is, just that recognition if these advisors are going to be remote, they're not going to have the same level of support, instantly available to them. So they need to be empowered, but we also need to enable them with the right knowledge and the right tools to, set them up to deliver great customer service. So, I think we need to make sure that our most experienced colleagues are now on the front line, particularly when working remote, given that, not lack of support, but the support will not be as readily available as being able to turn to the person in your left in the office and ask them a question.
We're back to swiveling the chair again. And for me, just one thing that strikes me is that if we are doing more home working and there is more of a hybrid mix, then we will have a wider recruitment opportunity because we'll have a bigger pool from which to draw these advisors of the future. Joanne, you're nodding. Do you think I'm right? Or am I being overly optimistic?
No, look, you're absolutely right, Liz, and we're looking at that whole onboarding induction process at the moment, and it gives us that real opportunity for a virtual experience and we're widening our net from an attraction perspective. So I think this gives us a fabulous opportunity in the industry.
Thank you all very, very much indeed, Richard Kenny, Joanne Wilson and Ross Vincent, for joining us for the debate. If we were here live in the Etihad in Manchester, we'd be giving you a big round of applause. But you'll have to take it from me that we are all applauding, and thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us. Now, Pauline is going to give us a couple of quick poll questions, after which we'll have our break. But I think I should say that we'll probably be talking a lot in the year to come about the future of work at CCA, and it would be great to have any other future, any comments that you'd like to put to us, any topics that you'd like to see us cover on some of our debates as the year goes by, then please, that would be absolutely terrific. We'd love to hear from you. So keep the comments, keep the questions, demands for debate topics, etc. coming in. And there we are. We've got the first of the poll questions. Now, these polls are very easy to operate. You simply click on the yes, no, or unsure and submit. The first question is, in your opinion, do we underestimate the complexity in today's frontline roles? That's something that the panel has discussed, but you in the audience, in your opinion, do we underestimate the complexity in today's frontline roles? Yes, no, or unsure. And once you've submitted that, we'll get to see the one behind. I don't get to see the answers, unfortunately, but it's really helpful for our own research if you can answer the poll question for us. That's great. And Pauline, do you have a second question for us, or is that it for no? Oh, look, there we are. I've got the results. Sorry. I think the answer was overwhelmingly yes. And the second poll question is, in your opinion, will we see a resurgence or a desire for resurgence in voice communications to meet future needs? Yes, no, or unsure. In your opinion, will we see a resurgence or a desire for resurgence in voice communications to meet future needs? Great. Thank you very much. Are we getting a sneak preview, Pauline, of the outcome? Oh, lovely. Yes. 55% say yes. A quarter almost say no, and a fifth say unsure. Great. So those are things that we will be talking about as the year goes on. In the meantime, if you'd like to take a quick comfort break, and we will come back. The time is now 32. Why don't we come back and start again at 11:37? Time for a coffee. And we will see you at 11:37. Thank you. welcome back. Hopefully, time for that coffee. And it's now time to hear from Andy Menz. Not only is he Director of Operations at Gavi Alliance, but he's also Chair of the CCA Excellence Awards Judging Panel. And I'm looking forward to finding out if Andy can tell us if there will be a coronavirus vaccine with us anytime soon. Andy, can you answer that question?
Hi everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Andrew Menz and I'm chair of the CCA Excellence Awards panel. So I'll know many of you from talking to you over the years about the submissions that you put forward. I suspect even for those people that I do know, you probably won't recognise my hairstyle at the moment, but I'll come back to that in a second. I very much hope that all of you and your loved ones are safe at this very difficult time. The reason I'm chair of the CCA is, in terms of their awards panel, is that I worked in the contact centre industry for over 20 years. But for the last 8, I've worked as operations director for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And it is really in that capacity that Anne-Marie and Sharon asked me to speak to you today, particularly in light of the COVID-19 situation that we're dealing with. To this end, I really want to cover 3 things. Firstly, to give you an overview of what Gavi is and what it does and why it's relevant in this space. Secondly, in my role of operations director, to talk to some of the operational challenges we have and are facing, many of which will be similar to those that you face, and also to do a little bit of fact checking around some of the science associated with that. And lastly, to talk about the Global Vaccine Summit, which we jointly led with the UK government on the 4th of June, to talk about the outcomes of that and the impact that I think it will have globally in the coming years. So firstly, what is Gavi and what do we do? Well, in a nutshell, we raise funds to try and ensure that every child born will have access to the same life-saving vaccines wherever they are in the world. So the same vaccinations that your children would have in normal course from the NHS as part of standard vaccination programs. So we want equity in that respect. We were formed 20 years ago as a public-private partnership to specifically improve access to vaccines for children. At that time, coverage rates, or distribution you might say, in the private sector, the rates of coverage, the amount of children that were getting vaccines was static or falling. And so Gavi was created to really focus on that with UNICEF and drive an improvement with that mission. Our board, which was formed at that point, is made up of everybody who has a stake in that process. So from the vaccine manufacturers through to our partners in WHO and UNICEF, along with our donors and donor governments, and also recipient governments and other interested bodies around that space, people like Save the Children, for example. So all of the stakeholders have got some skin in the game in that regard to focus on that mission. Our model is relatively straightforward. We raise funds from nation states and private donors, and through UNICEF, we use that money to purchase and deliver vaccines. The model is also sustainable as countries apply for that support, and we will generally pay 100% of the cost of the vaccines at the beginning, but over 5 years, the recipient countries will pay an increasing amount towards those vaccines to a point where hopefully after 5 years, they graduate in our terms and fund the vaccine fully themselves. Because we're the largest procurer of vaccines in the world, we also drive down cost. To put that into perspective, in the last 5 years, we've funded vaccinations for over 380 million children, preventing, we're almost certain, 6 million deaths at least. And last year, 1 in every 2 vaccines that were given to children across the world were Gavi funded. So we work in the space of delivering vaccines and strengthening health systems. So the COVID-19 crisis is very much something we're working on and is a familiar space to us. And in addition to that, and really the second piece I wanted to touch on relates to our operational response to COVID-19, both in terms of the mission, but also in how we operate just like any other business across our offices here in Geneva and across the Atlantic in Washington, DC. So the burning question that I know everybody always wants to ask is, when will there be a vaccine? And to be fair, I'm not an expert in that space, but I do work closely with many expert, prominent epidemiologists. Like so many questions relating to COVID-19, the real answer is we don't know exactly. As you probably all know, there are now over 100 potential vaccines in development, and the most optimistic suggestions would point to the fall, so potentially September or October. A more pragmatic or realistic timescale would say any vaccine development could take up to 2 years. And so, in terms of the time, we've probably got another 18 months to wait. The reality is, and for any of you that have worked in research and development, you'll know this, much of that comes down to testing. Testing to ensure that a vaccine is safe, testing to ensure that it's safe for everybody. So there's a real possibility here that we might need a different vaccine for different groups of people. What may be great for younger people could be dangerous and not effective for older people or vulnerable groups. Hopefully we'll have one that covers all, but we need to test and make sure. The second piece, again, which is, research and development basic, is that if we want to test whether a successful vaccine gives you immunity for 6 months or more, we have to test it for 6 months or more. It's the only way that we can really know. So maybe that sounds a bit pessimistic, but the good news is that, this is the number one focus of all the best people globally. And there are several vaccines already in human trial phase, and it is much more possible or probable that we will find a successful vaccine soon. And at that point, Gavi is ready to ensure that it is rolled out globally and ensure that this global problem is tackled at a global scale. And that minimizes the risk that pockets of the virus will remain somewhere in the world and potentially could mutate and come back, and the vaccine that we have developed may not be effective. So we need to eradicate this on a global scale. The other challenge for Gavi and the countries that we support is that initial studies show that if weaker health systems, like those in most of the countries in which we operate, focus solely on COVID or fall over due to COVID, many more lives will be lost to other vaccine preventable diseases than COVID-19. So the real challenge for us is to maintain the momentum in tackling those other diseases whilst being ready and able to strengthen health systems and roll out COVID-19 vaccine when it is ready. At a much more operational level, we're also reviewing our policies against safe distancing, use of masks, temperature checking in the workplace. And, again, that's an area where there isn't an exact answer and research is ongoing. But what we do know at this stage is that social distancing or safe distancing is working. Why is it so difficult for governments to define this? I think, I've seen on the UK TV, on the daily press briefing, many questions about 1 metre versus 2 metres. Well, if you've ever worked in security management or risk management, you'll know that there are no absolutes. When it comes to travel security, as an example, we often hear the phrase or use the phrase, only travel if it's essential. And people focusing on that word, well, what does essential mean? Which is quite understandable. In this context, what does safe mean? And that's the debatable point. Some of you may have read a recent Lancet article which referenced some of their research and also WHO research, which suggested that, over 1 metre, the risk, or 1 metre distancing, the risk is significantly reduced and potentially halves with every additional metre. So really, the answer to the question is what is your risk tolerance? You've got to also consider transmission rates as well. So how likely is it that you will come into contact with somebody who might have the virus? So at over 1 metre, the chances of getting the virus reduces to 3% or below. And as I say, it halves with every subsequent metre. So the truth is, you get increasingly safe the further away you go. But the question is then what rule do you apply? And really, that's the challenge. And that has to also depend upon the transmission rates, as I've suggested. And that's even before you take into account the social economic factors. So it's a complex puzzle for governments to figure out. It's the same with masks. Wearing masks or face coverings should not be considered a protective measure. It is instead a preventative one. If you have the virus, or even if you have a common cold or anything else like that, if you're wearing a face covering, you will greatly reduce the risk of transmission. And that's particularly relevant if you're in sort of contact situations like the workplace or shops. So it's important that everyone wears a mask in those kinds of environments. But again, it's a preventative measure, not a protective one. It's not a silver bullet, but it has to be part of a combined solution to help drive out the virus. And then finally, it's the same with temperature checking. It's something that we do, but only as part of a combined approach. Staff could have the virus and not have a temperature. By the same token, we absolutely know that in spite of continued messaging for staff in organisations to stay at home if they're displaying symptoms, any kinds of symptoms, dedicated staff in any business might still try and come to work. So it forms a third part of that kind of barrier or protective shield in the workplace or in other environments where you've got lots of people gathering. And then finally, with all of those measures, none are fail safe, but working together, they really help reduce the risk of transmission. And furthermore, as is the case with travel security when we're looking after people in dangerous places, you put measures in place primarily to keep them safe, but it's also super important to make sure they feel safe. And all of the measures I've just talked about will help people feel safer. The challenge globally at the moment in this space is that countries aren't aligned on measures. Even in the UK, where all of the nation or national governments come together, they're all sharing the same intelligence, the same scientific output, they're all in the same COBRA meetings, and yet typically, whether it's England, Scotland, Northern Ireland or Wales, they come up with a slightly different answer. It's the same in Europe. There isn't a global playbook, and the challenge with that is when people come up with different answers, the press, public individuals get confused and ask the question, and we exert a lot of energy in questioning why there's a difference rather than focusing on deploying these measures and focusing on eradicating the virus. So for me, it's a huge distraction, and it's a real shame that individual governments in different countries aren't adopting the same practice. That also, drives a lack of trust. And I think the fear of this virus doesn't help with that either. At Gavi, our mission is clear. Vaccines work, and that global problems require global answers. So to end today, I just wanted to touch on our Global Vaccine Summit on June the 4th. Gavi raises funds on a 5-year cycle, and we planned to be in London that day. We were going to be at the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre near to the Houses of Parliament. We're going to kick the thing off the night before at the Science Museum. And hopefully we were looking to raise $7.4 billion to save those children over the next 5 years. Then COVID happened, and we had to go virtual with the summit, which was first of all, was a huge challenge. And secondly, and more importantly, we were unsure as to what impact the COVID-19 situation would have on our ask to replenish our funds. On the one hand, economies were suffering, leaders were distracted, the world to some extent was in chaos. But on the other, globally, if the world didn't recognise during the COVID-19 crisis the need for a global solution and the power of vaccines, if they didn't realise that then, when were they going to realise that? And so I'm very pleased to say that in a world with so many challenges at the moment, with a growing lack of unity, the world came together for us. We see lots of bad news on the TV, clashes on the streets, people are angry. But in the same way that I guess all of you could tell a story about people coming together in your community, working together to help each other, the incredible work that many are doing in the UK to help each other from different social groups, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different age groups. Everyone's coming together to try and help each other. And of course, there's also the heroic efforts of the NHS. So in the same way that those people are coming together, the world came together to support Gavi. Led by the UK, 50 world leaders spoke with one voice and one message. All of the G7 were there. All but one of the G20 were there. And that was only because of technical issues. Donald Trump spoke in unison with Dr. Tedros from WHO, in spite of everything that was going on, in spite of the US pulling their funding for WHO. The US and China spoke with one voice. They had a common message in spite of everything, and so did Russia. Everyone strove to work together and support Gavi. So in the end, after 3 hours, we raised $8.8 billion, which means that in spite of everything, we will vaccinate over 380 million children in the next 5 years. We know we will prevent 6 million deaths or more. We will also prevent an unimaginable amount of parents' tears. And we're supporting the development of a vaccine. And when that vaccine for COVID-19 is ready, we are ready to ensure that everyone has access to it. While some of what I've said today may not have been the most positive news you've heard, or you may have been expecting to hear something more upbeat, I hope that what I've ended on will give you the same hope it has given me at this very difficult time. The Global Vaccine Summit has given us hope and the knowledge that the world can come together to solve this, and that we are ready, and that we will solve it together. It's just a matter of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy Menz. I think that will go down on my list. I'm going to write that down on my list of positives that the psychotherapist Rose Taylor was talking about earlier on this morning. And Andy, I know you're in your garden in Geneva. You talk to us from there. I know you're there to answer any questions that we might have. Can you tell me, and I don't know whether or not you've read all the guidelines in detail, but it seems to me that there are rafts and rafts of current guidelines around about safe distancing, wearing masks, getting people back to work, etc. But some of those guidelines are so complex, so long, they're not getting through to where they need to get to. You know, are we just not getting the messages through well enough?
Well, that's a really, really good question, Liz. I think there's always got to be a balance. I know certainly from a UK government perspective, they're very fond of sort of the three key messages. And that kind of probably sits at too high a level in some ways, but hopefully people, understand when they're being compliant with the guidelines, why they're being compliant. But you're absolutely right. And I think certainly when I've briefed our staff, for me, you really need to take the time out to explain. Some of it, of course, is common sense, but yeah, people are scared. People are very nervous, and if you've been away from the facility that you work in for 3 months or more, it is daunting for people. And I'm not talking about the people that might have vulnerabilities. For anybody going back, it's a scary time. And I think when you hit on a scary time, you crave that detail to know the things that will ensure that you're as safe as you can be. And so, yeah, but I would also argue on the flip side, from a government perspective, it is also incredibly difficult to cover off in short time the level of detail to ensure that they don't miss people. I think you've probably seen on the TV, Liz, that there are different examples of different types of employees in different environments that somehow have been missed off from either a support perspective or understanding. I saw an article today talking about driving instructors as an example, and how do they operate? How can they operate going forward? So I don't have the answer. I think the only thing I would say, which just kind of touched on earlier, is that the lack of this kind of global playbook, something that Bill Gates pointed to 2 years ago, is a real shame. The responsibility for that can't sit with WHO. I think governments across the world, now that we've gone through this experience, really need to put together and maybe work through WHO a set of guidelines for this type of virus that can be adapted, that covers all aspects. And hopefully that will happen. And in the future, should we come into these circumstances again, then that'll be available. I think for now, again, I think people need to spend the time to go through the detail in the different organisations to try and boil that down to as simpler messages as you can to make sure that people understand. I guess my fear is, working in crisis management for a few years, that once the crisis is over, attention will be diverted back to the normal day-to-day stuff. And so planning for the next time might not be on everybody's agenda, but I think it needs to be. And I think, really what we've seen this time is, a fantastic effort by lots of organisations. I touched on the NHS there to cope. The government, I think, has done very well in many ways, but to say we were prepared would be wrong. And I think next time we need to be prepared, and those messages need to be clear for sure.
Thank you very much indeed. You didn't mention your hairstyle, which looks great, looks absolutely great to me. When's the hairdressers opening in Geneva?
So we've actually had hairdressers back in place for about 6 weeks now. But I foolishly said at an all staff meeting that I wouldn't cut it until we had a vaccine. So I'm optimistic for the fall, but I did have a dream the other night that my youngest son discovered the vaccine when he grew up and became an epidemiologist rather, and I was looking like Gandalf at that point. So hopefully it won't be that long.
And hopefully we'll meet you in person before that happens. The $8.8 billion, absolutely unbelievable. Thank you very much, Andy Menz, for explaining something to, help us really get the picture of what's going on out there. That was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to move on to our final speaker for the day and for this event. And just to emphasize the fact that, of course, CCA is very much global, we are talking to Professor Liberty Bittert, and she's on her porch in the US. And she is going to continue the conversation that we started on Tuesday with Mark from O2 about the future of work. Her presentation will be followed by a few questions if we possibly can. I realize I've just forgotten a poll that we wanted to, so before we come to Liberty, can I just ask you to submit your answers to this question? What would you like to see more of at future virtual events from CCA? Industry case studies, panel discussions, subject matter experts, polling and benchmarking, motivational and leadership speakers. If you would click your buttons and submit, that would be great. Thank you. Great. And so thank you for that. The industry case studies win the day, I think, with about with about 2/3 of your votes. And we will pay attention to what you are saying. Panel discussions, subject matter experts, more than half. Polling and benchmarking, we're not so keen on that, not quite a third. And 2/3 of speakers would like motivational and leadership speakers. So there you are. We will be listening. Thank you very much indeed. And so, as I said, on to the last speaker, Professor Liberty Bittert, on the future of work.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know this is probably the worst time ever to give a talk right before lunch where everyone wants to just go eat. So I'll try to be quick to let everyone get going, but also please feel free to make this interactive, ask questions in the Zoom chat. Like, I'm here to answer anything or to do my best to educate on the research that we've been doing recently. So what I wanted to talk about today was the single most frequently asked question I get right now, the future of work. What is going to happen? It's the foremost question on everyone's mind. And I want to take us through sort of the process that we've been thinking about, all the research that's going on, and really come to sort of a conclusion, our best guess about where the situation is going. The problem with Zoom is that you see yourself in here and then you see all your hair everywhere. Sorry. So let's get to it. What is the question? Working from home. Is it working? Is it not working? That's me working from home with Henry, the cutest dog in the world. It's clearly working for him. I'm not sure it's working for me, but it's definitely working for him. And are you shirking from home? Are you working or are you shirking? Are you sleeping? Are you doing yoga? Or do you have crying children? Do you have, again, the cutest dog in the world, Henry, staring at you over your computer screen? What is working for you? I mean, you guys yourselves, a lot of you are still working from home, and a lot of your employees are all working from home. So it's this really confusing question of, does it work or not? So let's start to look at what we know and what we don't know from the data about whether working from home works. There was a study done on C-Trip, which is a Chinese travel agency company, and it has 16,000 employees. It's NASDAQ listed. And it did a 9-month study of working from home versus in the office. Call center employees volunteered to work from home, and they were randomly assigned to either work from home or in the office for 9 months. And they determined that home working led to a 13% increase in performance overall. And breaking that research down, what they determined was that 9.5% of the increase in productivity was down to home employees working more hours. They started on time, they were unhampered by traffic, the usual excuse that I use. They took fewer breaks, less gossiping at the water cooler. I go on dailymail.com, can't help myself. And they had fewer days off sick. The other 3.5% was an increase because they took more calls per minute. The conclusion was that this quiet working environment allowed them to concentrate a lot more, to sort of move quicker through the calls, and a fact that anyone who's been on a call center floor in a busy day can appreciate the sound difference. And what's more, they found is that working from home led to a higher job satisfaction, and the working from home group was 50% less likely to leave than their colleagues who stayed in the office. And it just, from that study, it seems like a no-brainer, right? Interestingly, though, actually, after a 9-month trial, half of those who work from home chose to go back to the office. The peace and quiet of home can very quickly feel like isolation to some people, myself included. But due to the success of the experiment, C-TRIP rolled out the option to working from home for the whole firm and allowed all the experimental employees to reselect between home and office, and half switched over, which led to gains from working from home almost doubling to 22% after those who didn't want to work from home moved back. So that sort of really what that showed is that choice is key, that some people like to work from home and some people don't. But there's a little bit more to this study that isn't quite as clear as one would hope. So something sort of important is missing, and I apologize. We're going to have to take a step back into the statistics a little bit, so bear with me, but they should be not too miserable for people who hated statistics in school. Let's take an example of why there was an issue with C-TRIP in this study. So Time Magazine does a person of the century. I would say every century, but they've only been doing it one century. So they've done it once. But what they did was they asked all their readers, put out online, everything, who do you think should be the person of the century? And they asked people to vote. And there were the regular contenders. There was Albert Einstein, we all know who that is, Jesus, Adolf Hitler, I know that's a South Park something. I don't, whatever. Most people know who that is. But there was one person who I will admit, I didn't even know who this was. I don't know why I say I didn't even know, like that matters. But anyway, I had no clue who this was. And I'm not sure, do any of you guys know who this is? Any thoughts? Any ideas? If you do, are you potentially from Turkey? You would think that for the person of the century, when all these other 4 characters are so recognizable, that this person would be too. You'd have some idea who the person was. And it turns out that it is Mustafa Ataturk. He was a write-in candidate, not even one of the people that Time listed as someone you could vote on. And he was the founder of the modern secular Turkish Republic. And he won by a margin of 500%. He was number uno in terms of the person of the century, which is kind of odd, right? Not to say he didn't do great things, but it wouldn't be who you would expect a bunch of people who read Time Magazine to pick, because I had no idea who he was. How did that happen? It turned out that newspapers in Turkey for months leading up to this would put ads every day telling people to go and vote and write in Mustafa Ataturk as the write-in candidate for person of the century. Over and over. I mean, the advertising was insane around it. So Time Magazine decided to rethink this once they figured out what had happened, and Albert Einstein ended up being the person of the century. But what it shows us is that when you have the wrong sample, right? So when your group that you're looking at is the wrong sample, which it was, because this had clearly been really pushed in Turkey, and there was one candidate that was pushed way more than others, that things really don't work out. The data doesn't tell you what it's supposed to tell. Knowing what the sample is, who's doing the study, who's in the study, is really important, what data you're looking at. And we'll look at one more example of that. This is the Tom Cruise debacle. I'm not sure if everyone remembers this, but that's when he jumped around on Oprah's couch. It was highly discussed in the media as to what happened. Did he go crazy? What happened? Who knows? And a magazine called Parade Magazine did a poll. And who's to say what's normal? Jumping on couches may be normal for you. I don't know. But they wanted to say, who's to say what's normal? And they did a poll. They said, is Tom to blame or is the media to blame? Do they make him crazy? And it turned out that the poll returned that 84% of people believe the media is at fault. Tom Cruise, it's not his fault. He didn't do anything wrong. The media made him do it. Okay, well, that's what your data is telling you. 84% of people believe the media is at fault. But when you look a little bit closer at who the sample is, who's answering this study, who's doing this study, you learn that 14,000 of the 18,000 votes came from the same 10 computers, and 8,400 votes came from one computer. And it happened that a bunch of these computers were located in a cafe right next to the headquarters of the Church of Scientology. So you start to realize that maybe not everybody thinks that Tom isn't to blame and that it's all the media's fault. So again, what this just illustrates is how important the sample is, how important it is who you're asking these data of and who you're taking the data about. And so what does that really have to do with our C-TRIP study? I want to look at this one more time. I said very clearly that call center employees were taken and split into two groups randomly, working from home and not working from home. What wasn't as clear is that these call center employees all volunteered for a work from home program. So C-TRIP asked people to participate in a work from home experiment. And then they were randomly, they had no idea this was happening. They were randomly split up into work from home and not work from home. Meaning that all the employees that signed up for the experiment wanted to work from home. So if all of a sudden half of your staff wanted to work from home and now they're told, no, you can't, but everybody else gets to, the other half of the group, like, duh, working from home group 50% less likely to leave than the people that wanted to work from home but are now forced to stay at the office for 9 months while all their friends are working from home. So there's a little bit more to this, right? We can't just take these numbers at total face value and say, oh, working from home totally works, because it doesn't all the time. Not to say that it never works, but let's take a look at IBM and what they did in terms of working from home. In 1979 in Silicon Valley, IBM had a log jam in their office mainframe. So they installed those huge green screen terminals in the homes of 5 employees to do an experiment and see how working from home went. Now, in 1979, working from home is a little bit different. The high-speed internet, the internet at all, whatever, was a little bit different. But it seemed to work anyway. By 1983, 2,000 IBM employees were doing work from home. And in 2009, IBM boasted that 40% of IBM's 386,000, it's on the screen, don't have to remember that, 386,000 employees were working from home. And this saved IBM 58 million square feet of office space, over $2 billion. I mean, there was enormous savings from having employees not have to be somewhere. Side note, they also sold their consulting service on why this was so wonderful to many other companies. So, they also made a little bit of a profit off of this. But something funny happened. In 2017, they changed their minds. They said, we actually want everyone to come into the office to work. And the question is, why? Why would they change their minds so drastically? And here's the problem. Working from home doesn't always work. And there's studies that say it's going to work. There's studies that say it's not going to work. And the data tend to talk past each other. One study that actually looks really good says that working from home works. One study that looks really good says it doesn't work at all. So what's the deal here? And the trick is, what kind of productivity are you looking for? What kind of performance are you looking for out of your employees to know whether working from home is really going to work, and whether this new age with coronavirus that especially your front line is working from home a good thing. So what do they say? What does the research say? It says that there's 2 types of productivity. There's personal productivity, which is how many sales you close. Sorry, I lost my train of thought on this. Here I It's how many sales you close or customer complaints you handle. Then the research on balance suggests that it's better to let people work when they want and where they want. So if it's sales, personal productivity, you individually get to do something, then it's much better. So for jobs where people really interact with clients, consultants, insurance salesmen, or ones where there's really no interaction at all, journalists, whatever, the office actually just interrupts things and makes it way worse. But you have another type of productivity. So in this personal productivity, working from home tends to work most of the time. Some more caveats we'll talk about. But there's another type of productivity, and that's called collaborative efficiency. So that's the speed at which a group solves a problem. And distance seems to drag collaborative efficiency way down. And why is the short answer is that collaboration is communication. And communications technology is for the moment really still at the office. Now, yeah, we have zillions of emails. We have all these sorts of things. I mean, geez, I actually feel like I'm getting less emails from people that work 12 feet away from me now that I'm home rather than when I was there. And that's really important to understand is actually the distance of the communication. And whether that is that you're actually putting people in a group to work together, or they're sitting at a table with 12 people at a table. We'll get to that. It's going to remind you a lot of what a call center looks like. And being able to see what other people are doing and sort of the motivation of other people doing things. Or whether it's like sitting around the water cooler and, oh, I had this really hard thing. I had this really hard customer, this really hard problem. How do I do it? And people can talk with each other about fixing things and solving and collaborating together. So let's just take a very brief example. I want you to consider what is a very tiny office. Hold on. So let's consider a very specific type of office for a simple example, an airplane simulator. Okay, it's a tiny office. Well, I mean, frankly, that simulator, it looks pretty big, but technically speaking, it's a tiny office and they did a simulation. So they took 3 crew members and they stuffed them in there, wrapped them in all these instrument panels and, comfort wise, it's not that fabulous, but the forced proximity really benefited crew communication. Researchers, I think it was UC San Diego and let me look at my notes, UC Irvine, demonstrated this analysis. And it was specifically the moments after one crew member diagnosed a fuel leak. Okay, so there's the other 2 crew members, there's one guy, he has now just diagnosed a fuel leak and said it. Communication, when they recorded it, is actually enacted through a series of really quick gestures at the instrument panel, some few short utterances, and it's this model of collaborative efficiency that takes 24 seconds with barely talking to each other. In the email world, the same exchange, you're trying to point at things, utter things, move things, it could take dozens of emails back and forth to be able to fix a problem like this, which, given the fact that in this situation, the fuel tank would have been emptying very quickly, is certainly not ideal. So in this case, it shows you that when you need to collaborate, when there's an efficiency aspect to it, being together is incredibly important. And not even just being together connected remotely, but actually physically together, pointing at things, talking about things. You guys can't see what I'm pointing at. Well, you can, but over there is really important. And it brings us to this question of, we've gone through this. We've talked about what works, what doesn't work. One study works, one study doesn't work. The data is telling us all the things. What's the answer? Is working from home the future? Is that what you should say the front line should do? Is that the best thing? Is that the best thing for you? Here's the answer that the research is basically saying, pretty strongly actually to me, is that halfway doesn't cut it. It's got to be all or nothing. It's working from home or not. These models where we're starting to bring people back and everyone's feet away from each other and all this sort of social distancing aspects actually doesn't work. And here's why. There's a weakness. It's the data for this research is really telling us that human nature throws a big wrench into what should work, what the data should tell us is working. Back in 1977, an MIT professor, Thomas Allen, looked at communication patterns and found out that the farther apart physically people's desks were, the less likely that they were to communicate. And I mean by feet. I'm not talking like, miles or different buildings. I'm literally talking desks by feet. Most emails that you get in the office in general, like statistically speaking, are from people within 20 feet of you. What he found is that at the 30-meter mark, the likelihood of regular communication approaches zero, which is to say that if you bring back people partially, you're losing everything, right? So you're not getting the benefits of working from home, and you're not getting the benefits of this collaborative environment where people are communicating. So it's saying that halfway is actually the wrong way. It's all or nothing is the best thing for people working from home. There was one study that really sort of emphasized this, and this was Ford Motor. This was in the late 1990s, and this, if anyone has been in call centers recently, this actually highly resembles what one looks like. You have teams of tables. In this case, there were 6 to 8 employees of Ford per team, per table. And it was this sort of like experimental war room, which was arranged to maximize the team members' peripheral, actual physical peripheral awareness of what others were doing. And the results were insane. The teams completed their projects, completed each of their individual works in a third of the time that it usually takes Ford employees to do. I can't remember what it was. It was some project that they were working on, all doing very different things and completing very different tasks. They completed their work in a third of the time. Not so much because they were communicating, but because they could actually physically see what someone else was doing, the motivating factor of someone else being there. It really changes things. So I guess what the sort of results are of research so far, and by far the most frequently asked question I've gotten, is that, again, halfway doesn't work. Either people work from home and they get the benefits, and there's going to be negatives too, but they get the benefits of working from home, or they don't, and they come back fully to the office, fully in these collaborative environments. But that this halfway idea of having people come back and, be spread apart and physically spread apart is really the worst possible option, and the one that nothing works, because you don't get the benefits of working from home and you don't get the benefits of the collaboration. Which may not be a lot of hope at the moment, but I think it's a really important aspect as we all start to think about going back to work and how to best organize people coming back to work, especially people on the front line for customer service. These teams, again, really look like a call center to me. And what really is the best thing for the company, and what is the best thing for the customer? Because the best thing for the customer is that they get their problem resolved in a wonderful way, and that they are loyal to to the company. And if your employees are not working well, if they're in this sort of halfway situation, which we know is really not the right way to work, inevitably everything falls apart. And it's not good for your employees either. So I think that's really the biggest takeaway I've been thinking about and working on in terms of this future of work question. Thank you all so much. And any questions before you go to lunch, before you get to run off and eat?
Afternoon, Liberty. Thank you so much for that. It's Pauline from CCA here. So there's a couple of questions I've got I want to just run through whilst we have you. So that was a really fascinating run through of lots of different pieces of information and some great takeaways, I'm sure, for all of our attendees. One thing that I thought was really interesting to pick up was about almost be careful who you're asking and how you're asking the question. So that piece you mentioned about the importance of sample size. The customer service piece is obviously well measured, whether that's for CSAT or employee SAT. There's lots of consultations going on just now with organisations, particularly around with their employees about their tendency to want to come back to work, their nervousness about it. What advice might you offer to businesses and how they ask the right questions so that they get the right results and know that they're doing the right things when it comes to bringing people back into an office environment?
A lot of what the decision is in terms of bringing people back is actually what the customer is wanting. And this, just bear with me for a second. What we've seen in sort of the most up-to-date research is that Whereas there used to be people, sort of customers along the spectrum. If some people want to talk for a while, some people want to chit chat, some people just want to do the live chat and get things done as fast as possible. That we're getting even more extreme in terms of what customers want. Some want to someone to get off even faster, like get this done as fast as possible without even barely talking to a human. And some people really, really want to talk even longer and have a real conversation and experience with whoever is helping them. And the problem is that the employees are actually quite different in terms of what they're able to deliver. I mean, it's just getting what they're being asked to deliver to customers is the two extremes. So part of it is actually figuring out the personality of your employee and who is better at which type of interaction, and actually potentially splitting your employees in terms of who is really good at that very quick interaction and who is very good at that longer discussion, and being able to figure out which one the customer wants very quickly.
It's a big challenge in trying to make people feel secure, clearly, about coming back in, and lots of nervousness for lots of different reasons. But yeah, thank you for that, Liberty. I think as well a really important piece is about the communication and connection with colleagues and teams is really challenging. And some of the things that you mentioned there about how many emails you get from people that are literally sitting on your shoulder, and lots of people have come to us and talked about the challenges that they're having around that, keeping teams engaged, keeping people feeling connected with the organisation. What should be top of mind for businesses when they're thinking about processes and procedures and ways of doing things that, for that communication piece?
Well, I think one thing that's really important, and let me just look at the chat really quick, because there's some really good questions in there that relate to this. And it has, there's one question here from Dan about, positive changes over time as someone remained at home. There have been studies about that, but the difference is that it's all been volunteer based. So in the past, when people work from home, it's because they want to. Whereas now we're in this situation where people are being forced to. And so unfortunately, there is no good research on what happens over time when people are forced to work from home. Do they get used to it and then it becomes normal or not? We don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you, Dan, on that one, because it's a great question. And then, someone else asked, in the home office versus on home versus office, some people are wanting like a day or a week, a month to have the social element. And that actually solves a ton of the problems, because you get the benefits of working from home, but you also have sort of a week or a day a week or whatever to have that real collaboration. The problem is that you do not get that collaboration if you are physically distanced, which is what the government guidelines are saying is the only way we can go back to work. So it's this really difficult balance of that collaboration just doesn't exist when you're 6 feet apart and you're wearing masks and you can't sort of work with each other during the day. So yes, that would be great if it could be done in the way that would allow collaboration to actually work.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Liberty, for joining us today and for your recording. I should just ask you, where is it you're actually dialing in from, just so that we're making this as global a conference as we possibly can. So we've had Geneva already today. So where are you?
I am in Boston. I'm in Boston.
Fabulous. Well, very good morning to you in Boston. And thank you again, Liberty, for joining us today. And back to Liz just to finish us off. Thank you so much.
And that's it from us. And what a terrific 3 mornings we've had. I'm sure you'll agree. I've had a great time, and I've discovered that doing conferences this way can be very, very productive. I haven't had to stand around on my high heels for 3 mornings. And we've had the most amazing speakers all speaking to you from their own homes. So they've not had to travel. Now, we will be sending you a very short survey to find out what you think about this. Would you like us to do more conferences in this way? Do you think it's worked? What are your highlights from the last 3 days? And if you were to make any changes, what would they be? So that survey will be coming out from the team very, very soon. In the meantime, I'd like to say thank you again to all our sponsors, and they are Oracle, Twilio, and Vonage, who are our gold sponsors, and our silver sponsors, Polly. Thank you. Without you, this conference couldn't have happened. And I'd like to say thank you to all our speakers. I'm not going to name them because we've had such a number over the past 3 days, but I think you will agree that they were hugely insightful. So until we see you again, all I can say is that the recordings will be available. Team will send you the link should you wish to sit through it all over again or to share it with someone else. And safe home. Take care. See you soon.